And we're live.
Greetings and welcome to another DML Commons Salon. It's Tuesday, April 21st, 2015, and we're here for the second unit of the four-part Professional Pathways course hosted by the DML Hub. This unit's called Beyond the Ivory Tower, How to Bridge Digital Media and Learning Research with Action and Design Projects. And today we'll be talking about participatory and community-based approaches to questions like who does digital media and learning research, and who's it for? And we'll talk about some of the practical, political, and professional opportunities and challenges that these approaches raise. I'm Melissa Brough, a postdoctoral researcher with the Connected Learning Research Network at the DML Hub, and I'm co-facilitating this salon with Alicia Blum-Ross from the London School of Economics and Political Science and Anna Keune from Indiana University. And I'm excited to welcome our invited guests today, Julian Sefton-Green and Nancy Erbstein, who bring a range of backgrounds and expertise in participatory and community-based research. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves briefly now. So we'll start with Alicia, please.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Preparing for Digital Future research project here at the LSE, where we are looking at how parents approach the task of bringing up their children in a digital age.
Really cool. My name is Anna. I'm a second-year doctorate student at the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. Here I work with Dr. Kylie Pepler at the Creativity Labs, and I'm super interested in participatory design and the maker movement.
Hi, my name is Julian Sefton-Green. I work part-time at the London School of Economics on a project looking at young people's route to employment in the creative industries, and I've worked with DML for the last 4 or 5 years doing a year-long ethnography of 13 to 14-year-olds along with my colleague Sonia Livingston. And I have worked in a variety of different positions. I've been a high school teacher, I worked in teacher training, I worked in a community youth centre. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British and all of those places were in London. And then for the last 10 years I've also been a rarity. I've been effectively a self-employed academic or independent scholar, as I fancifully call myself. And I think all of those different positions have given me a different kind of take on why I do research and who's it for and what's the point of it.
Great. And Nancy?
Good day. I'm Nancy Erbstein. I'm a research faculty member in the Department of Human Ecology at UC Davis. My research really focuses on understanding, unpacking, and addressing disparities in youth well-being. I often talk about myself as an ambivalent academic. Like Julian, I've worked in a number of different positions. Actually, as a young person, came out of undergrad and co-founded an organization that trained young people to engage in participatory action research. I'm working in particular with typically underrepresented, marginalized youth populations and young adult populations throughout Northern California, although worked internationally as well, in South Asia, in the Russian Far East, and a little bit in South Africa. And moved into the academy, but in a position that's really enabled me to pursue research collaboration, building on my earlier work with young people, and have moved in more recent years to looking in particular at how increasing access to data and data mapping tools can enhance the efficacy of young equity advocates' organizing work. And that work is happening in California.
Great. Well, I came to the digital media and learning field having worked previously in some of the areas of participatory and community-based research, so I'm really thrilled, along with the rest of today's facilitators, to get this conversation going about how to bridge the two. So just a few more things before we get started. If you're watching this Hangout from the DML Commons webpage, we really encourage you to jump onto the Etherpad to converse with others who are watching or join in via the Twitter hashtag DML Commons. And we'll be posting links to resources in the Etherpad throughout the salon. please go ahead and add your name under the roll call so that we know that you're here. And also feel free to add suggestions to our list of discussion topics, pose questions, or note other relevant resources there. And secondly, as a way of sharing and promoting examples of participatory and community-based research or design, we invite everyone out there to flag relevant projects that you know of or have been a part of. So please use Twitter or the DML Commons blogs and the hashtag DML Commons to share resources and experiences. And Anna will compile these in a blog post that will then circulate back to everyone. So we're going to start today with a short warm-up activity and then jump into the conversation with Julian and Nancy. So I'm going to hand things over now to Alicia.
Sorry, I was on mute. In the spirit of participatory research, we thought we would try to do a little bit of participatory activity, although obviously this whole setup is participatory in a way. What I would like to signpost you guys to is if everyone has a look at the Etherpad, we've started with a question which we would like everyone to feed back on. It's hopefully a way for us to get to know a little bit more about your interests and backgrounds as well. And as it says activity, it says, who do you think your research is or could be for? And we've given a list, which is by no means a comprehensive list, of different kinds of constituent groups: practitioners, teachers, policymakers, young people, parents, your mom, etc. And what we'd like you to do is just add a +1 next to any and all of these groups that you think are relevant to your research, who you think your research is currently or could be for. And hopefully this will give us a bit of a sense of the spread. So I'm going to ask the speakers to do this as well, if you can, and we'll discuss in a moment. Okay, so we're getting quite a lot of practitioners, quite a lot of young people, and we can talk about the difference between targeting your research for and about young people to young people themselves. That's definitely something that came up in our pre-discussion as well. And again, feel free to write in any other constituent groups that you think aren't covered by the above.
You're seeing a lot of answers coming in here. That's such a colorful mix on the Etherpad.
Excellent. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of practitioners, a fair number of teachers and policymakers, community groups, young people. I think probably almost everyone has said young people. Few parents, people who might give me a job. Interestingly, only a few. So perhaps we can talk at some point in the seminar about how you express this kind of research within the context of applying for jobs, both academic and non-academic jobs, and how we find or might be able to find some value in this kind of research also within our own career trajectories. So it looks like, interestingly, my advisors only has a couple, so it makes me wonder, and perhaps this is a question we can all address later, if our advisors don't sometimes know how to make sense of this kind of research, if it's seen somehow as being not kind of academic enough. So that's something for discussion, and perhaps Julian and Nancy, you can also reflect on that. There's some great write-ins here at the bottom: industry, agency leaders, philanthropy, and nonprofits. So again, all different kind of constituency groups, sometimes overlapping and sometimes having really different interests or different ways of reading the research that we produce. I think we're going to start the discussion here, and perhaps Julian and Nancy I'll kind of guide you back to some of these questions as we go. But I'd like you guys to start, and maybe Nancy, perhaps we can start with you, because you called yourself a reluctant academic, and you've given us a brief introduction, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you kind of got to the point of doing the research that you're currently doing?
Sure. Well, coming out of I actually got involved in it quite early on. Coming out of my undergraduate work, I was working on educational reform in the United States, and I had the opportunity to be both working with some really quite renowned national reformers in the United States on the one hand, and then on the other hand was doing some work in English learners' classrooms, and was really noticing the disconnect between what students knew about their experience in school and what these immigrant students were experiencing on the one hand, and the kind of discourse that was in play in the national school reform arena on the other hand. I was really struck by the importance of bringing those young people's voices to bear upon what was happening in this policy planning and evaluation environment. And also had some experiences working in South Asia around nationalization of Nepalese education curricula and the experiences of some ethnic minority populations with that. And in that context began to develop some curricula that at that time I called youth-led research evaluation and planning, YouthRep, to engage young people in researching their own conditions and bringing that to bear upon planning and decision making. So it was very much kind of a critique of the politics of knowledge production and implementation that led me into this work. And then coming out of being an undergraduate student, I actually co-founded a nonprofit organization, an intermediary organization called Youth in Focus that was around for about 20 years to actually train young people and youth-serving organizations to engage young people in participatory action research, as well as evaluation and planning. So, and again, with a very specific focus on working with low-income youth, youth of color, LGBT youth, immigrant youth, formerly incarcerated youth. So that was really how I got my start, and I like to talk about that because I think sometimes, particularly in academia, we can turn to particular scholars who have been writing about youth participatory action research and not necessarily acknowledge that a lot of the work that's actually developed in this arena has been developed by folks working out in communities, and then, you know, academics have come and studied this work and written it up. But in fact, there's a lot of work that happens in the field that's not documented in the ways that are typically recognized by academia. And I like to tell that story, particularly when I'm working with young researchers, to acknowledge that, you know, I and other young people were really very engaged in building particularly this field of youth participatory action research that's now kind of ubiquitous in the field, but it wasn't 25 years ago. So
perhaps not as ubiquitous as we might like to see it, but certainly more popular than it once was. Julian, could you say, I mean, Nancy identified a particular problem, which I think we all see, which is the disconnect between practitioner experience and sometimes even between young people and young people's conception of their own learning and their own experiences in learning environments and environments in general with kind of what's written about or what's talked about them at a policy level or an academic level. Do you think that you had a sort of a similar problematic when you started this kind of research, as a particular bridge that you were trying to build, or can you say a bit more about what motivated you to get in this kind of research?
Sure. So, like Nancy's point about a particular kind of moment in time, this held true for me as well. So, I actually, without being too personal, I actually started trying to be a proper academic. So I started doing a DPhil in Elizabethan literature of the 1590s. Okay, And I couldn't see much point to this after a couple of years, so I just gave it up. But it is true to say that obviously I was interested in certain kinds of scholarship. And then, for a variety of reasons, I fell into being a high school teacher. And I was particularly interested in what was then an emerging subject of media studies, media education, which was very much a teacher-led movement in the mid and to late 1980s in England. And I was also studying to be a teacher, training to be a teacher at the Institute of Education, which had a long tradition of a certain kind of academic intellectual that I don't think has a similar tradition in the States, in as much as it was very much led by people who'd had direct practitioner experience and as teachers, whereas in the discipline of education, what we've seen over recent years is a professionalization of education. So a lot of people who are now education experts often haven't had direct experience teaching in schools, for example, whereas the Institute of Education had a particular kind of history of activist intellectuals, of people who'd worked in schools and with schools. And I'm also talking about a period in time where it was possible to influence what happened in schools as a teacher. So you had much more control as a head teacher, and particularly in regards to assessment and curriculum, new subjects like the one that I was involved in as media studies, media education, actually had a lot of power and authority to kind of develop curriculum and to develop assessment. So I was very, having kind of failed to be a sort of proper academic, I was very kind of inspired by working with my colleagues. And I would definitely point to the community of practitioners, by which I mean fellow teachers, who were developing syllabi, who were being in a position to kind of assess and validate young people's work, and who were developing a subject with young people where the whole point of media studies, media education at that time was to kind of give value and meaning to the cultural experiences of young people who are often excluded from school. And that was my experience working in an area of London called Tottenham, which is a very deprived area and very kind of vibrant in terms of being kind of multi-ethnic and multicultural in that kind of way. So my kind of starting point as a kind of in academic scholarship was actually working with teachers with the kind of problem of trying to find ways to understand the meanings that young people brought to media classrooms through their consumption of popular culture, and to find ways to kind of credentialize and validate that and to explore that. So I was immediately kind of faced with a problem of kind of giving that shape and form and meaning, and above all finding ways to theorize it. And secondly, it was absolutely extraordinary experience to work with a large community of fellow teachers in that way. So the knowledge I was working on, the kind of point of it all, absolutely had immediate, direct political purpose with that community of teachers, for that community of teachers, who were themselves very committed to working with the young people in the schools where they worked. And that was kind of how I kind of got started in that sense.
Thanks. I think it would be helpful at this point, actually, maybe to speak a little bit more detail about some of the projects that you guys have actually done. Either you could perhaps take an example. It could be a current project, or you know, a kind of a hallmark project that you've done previously. And if you could just walk us through a little bit, how did you go about setting it up? You know, where did the funding come from? What were the relationships that you had to broker? What were the sort of ethical promises, particularly in relationship to what you both introduced about the problems of translating people's on-the-ground experience into academic research, and also to have those then be valued by the people who eventually are going to come in contact with it. So let's just start with those three questions. So first of all, if you could, just to summarize again, each give us an example of a project either that you're currently working on, that you feel like you want to discuss from the past, and you know, what were the kind of questions that you started with, and what were the relationships that you had to broker, both in order to resource the project and also in order to do it. And then we'll perhaps come to a minute, then where did that project go? So Nancy, can we start with you?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear. Oh, you put yourself back on mute, Nancy.
How about now?
Great.
Excellent. Okay. Sorry, we're having some internet problems here on campus today as well, so it's that and my lack of familiarity with Google Hangout are a little bit of a challenge. So let me talk a little bit about a project that I'm in the midst of right now that I mentioned earlier, which is looking at how increased access to data and maps on youth well-being and racial and ethnic and spatial disparities in youth well-being can inform young advocates' work. So this work has emerged in collaboration with a number of different actors. On the one hand, young equity advocates, on the other hand, folks who are working in decision-making and planning environments across the arenas of education, public health, youth development, community development, and philanthropy as well. And this question emerged because for years, under my nonprofit hat, I had been working with young people supporting participatory action research to inform their engagement in policy development, planning, and evaluation. And sometimes they would run into this issue of decision makers really questioning them about the legitimacy of their research, smallish sample sizes, issues like that, because they were presenting their findings based on their research, but they weren't necessarily easily able to gain access to the large kind of quantitative analyses that policymakers were and planners were using to inform their thinking. And so once I came over to the university, I ended up in this situation where I was constantly having young advocates with whom I'd been in relationship contacting me and asking me for data and asking me if I could make a map or generate some analyses for them that they could use in combination with their own youth-generated research. And I really was both intrigued and frustrated by the fact that, you know, in many cases, young people and their adult allies were looking to tap publicly available data and data sets, but those data weren't particularly accessible, and then even if they could gain access to them, they didn't necessarily have opportunities to build the capacity to work with those data and look at them from a spatial vantage point. And so so I convened a team of colleagues and sort of put my academic hat on and started thinking about how might we construct some georeference measures of youth well-being that would rely on publicly available data, that would provide analyses at a pretty granular level, like in the United States at a sub-county level, and that we could make available online through an interactive GIS website. And so we developed that work with input from young people and received funding from a variety of sources to do that, primarily private foundations, but also some campus funds as well. And then I brought on...
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, can I just ask a quick question which has just come in via the Etherpad? If you could just clarify what type of populations you're talking about and that what you mean by diversity, if you just give us a little bit more information there.
So in terms of diversity, thinking about geographic diversity within California, as well as working with low-income youth, youth of color, immigrant youth, and formerly incarcerated youth, What I've gone on to do is work in collaboration, in particular with young people and youth-serving organizations in 3 communities in California. One is in a neighborhood that's been designated by some funders as really underinvested in, an urban neighborhood. I'm also working in a large town, primarily there with formerly incarcerated youth. Many of them are Latinos, African American and Southeast Asian youth as well. And then finally working with young, entirely Latino youth population in a rural community in Southern California. And these are all young people, again, that are connected with youth-serving organizations that are supporting their learning and their organizing work. So we've worked with them to develop curricula to not only enable them to use these online tools that we've developed, but to build their capacity to operate as critical consumers and producers of research and data, and to employ some of those analyses in combination with their own research that they're doing on their communities.
It sounds like an incredibly ambitious and very varied project. I just want to return to something that you said when you started talking about this initiative, which was that sometimes small-scale, qualitative, in-depth projects, which may be produced from, built on relationships that have been formed over many years, are not then taken very seriously at a policy level. Could you maybe say a little bit more about what you think are the limits of policymakers kind of reading participatory research in that sense, and how, from a university perspective, like you have, what can you do to kind of ameliorate that gap?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's always hard to know exactly what's going to drive policy change, right? Sometimes it can just be the one compelling story, right, that gets everybody very excited about moving a policy agenda. In other cases, it's the relationships, it's the link between a piece of research and somebody's active policy agenda and a moving train in a policy-making environment. And if there's a good fit, then there may not be so much concern about issues like sample size and bias and this and that. But there are times, particularly in the context of working on contentious issues or trying to raise new issues, that people, and sometimes with very good reason, will raise questions about what's typically a smaller sample size in a participatory action research project, or often a primary emphasis on qualitative data. And so, on the one hand, I guess what we've been really trying to encourage is this use of mixed methods, right? And so by providing these kinds of large-scale data sets, but also encouraging and supporting young people to point out the downsides of those analyses as well, and the ways in which some of the research they're doing can fill important gaps or raise important questions, can be really useful in that policy context, and provide young advocates, what they're showing us is that can provide a ways for them to really engage with some of those policymakers and planners' questions in ways that are more powerful than they were able to just with the qualitative work.
Thank you. I've got one more question for you, Nancy, just on that point, and then Julian will come on to your example in a minute. The question really is, there's two sides of who you have to convince of the utility of this kind of work. One is the funders, the policymakers, and the other is sometimes the young people themselves. You know, how do you get young people involved in research? Because you may think, you know, there's a sort of an imperative to get your voice heard or to participate, but you know, not all young people necessarily see why they should take their time to get involved in these kinds of research projects. I mean, I understand that you may have been working with pretty engaged young people, but could you say a little bit more about how you made that approach? You know, was there any difficulty in getting young people involved and sustaining their involvement and, you know, maybe convincing their teachers and parents that it was important for them to be involved, and how those conversations went?
Yeah, I have to say I've never run into problems getting young people involved. The adults tend to be much more challenging than the youth. Because the work that I've always been involved in has been very much tied to conditions that young people were contending with, and their families are contending with, and their siblings are contending with, and so I really haven't found it to be a challenge, and I haven't seen to be a challenge to get young people involved. Sustaining involvement can be a challenge because the young people that I'm working with also often have a lot going on in their lives, so there's a lot that can get in the way, a fair bit of instability that can get in the way of sustaining involvement. Another issue that can be a factor is young people needing to work, to earn money, to contribute to families. And so in working with organizations, when I was with an intermediary organization, we often encouraged organizations to find ways to offer stipends to young people, or salaries, particularly if they were doing work that was significantly contributing to the work of the organizational or institutional home in which they were based. In classroom settings, that's a bit different in terms of young people's participation in a context where they're maybe working on this as part of a course. I'll give an example here. We worked as an intermediary organization through a high school that decided to, for a variety of reasons, and in response to young people's organizing, developed a course on race and social justice in the United States. At first, there was people were concerned that nobody's going to sign up for this course. Everybody just wants to take a standard U.S. history course, or what we call an advanced placement U.S. history course in the United States that's weighted and sets you up for college. And they started out just by teaching in their first year one section of this course. They're now up to 9 sections of this course at this high school, in which young people are doing participatory action research on community conditions related to youth well-being, race, ethnicity, power, and it's the most popular U.S. history course at the high school. So I think oftentimes young people are really eager to have opportunities to engage with and discuss the kinds of dynamics of power and conditions that they're experiencing in their everyday lives. So the issue tends to be more, at least on the youth side, creating opportunities for them to do that through working with the adults and getting the adult buy-in and the kinds of resources needed to create those opportunities, as opposed to attracting young people to those opportunities.
I think just to underscore the points you made, in a way it's about creating some kind of value, and we'll come back to this concept of value in a little bit, for the young people themselves, whether that's value because they are themselves, clearly facing problems or dilemmas that they can see a connection to the research that you're not necessarily proposing to them, but asking them to kind of help inform, or value in terms of employment, whether it's actual paid employment or contribution to future skills, or whether it's because they're doing a project that this kind of research can contribute to. So in a way, in terms of practical feedback, it sounds like that is something that we should all consider when approaching and working with young people, is thinking really critically about what it is that they're getting out of it practically, ethically, and in terms of their own activism. Julian, can we ask you to do the same, perhaps walk us through a project that you've done, either currently are doing or have recently completed, and talk about how you went about setting it up, how you identified the research questions, who you were working with, what kinds of constituencies, and perhaps give us a preview of where you saw those outcomes going.
Yes, I'll try. It's difficult to know what kind of project to choose, because I've been involved in quite a few. I think in all honesty, I don't think I've been, although I've done a lot of research with young people and about young people, they haven't been quite the same sort of projects that Nancy's been talking about. So a kind of quick example of the sort of thing in that genre that I have done is where I worked was when I was working at the Youth Community Centre. We got a commission by the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, who asked us to kind of work with young people who were living in care. And we made a video with the young people to show back to a public-facing audience. And they all enjoyed making the video. It was a very powerful or positive learning experience, being engaged in telling their stories, and they enjoyed the process of making the video. And predictably, the actual showing of the video back to the social services and the people in the local authority who commissioned it was a disastrous and unpleasant experience, where obviously, despite everybody's best attempts to kind of stage manage the experience, it became kind of awkward and difficult, because there was a complete kind of contradiction between the way the young people wanted their stories to be told and the kind of well-meaning but kind of awkward response by the people who are responsible for them to be able to kind of cope with that experience. And even in the kind of sharing moment, I remember this kind of, that all the sort of important people who commissioned the video sat at the front and the kids kind of sat at the back. And then when we showed the kind of video, it was kind of a disproportionate kind of attempt to kind of control the language. And this is a kind of very common experience, and kids kind of know this and get a lot from it. And it's kind of, you do your best to try and preempt what you think is going to happen in those kind of experiences, but that's very difficult. And the kind of knowledge you're producing there is in the nature of the stories and the video. I wanted to also pick up on...
Sorry, Julian, can I just push you on that one a little bit? Because, I mean, to an extent what you're saying is that it's the dark side to participation, right? Like, you ask young people to contribute their voices to a project, and you kind of promise them that there's going to be some kind of outcome, and then ultimately...
you don't promise, you don't promise, because these young people who are in care already know how difficult life can be and how cruel adults who look after them end up being by, not cruel, that's extreme, because I meaning how difficult these kind of experiences are. You engage them in a political action, so you have some kind of public forum that you've given them a voice at. So although the outcome isn't positive, as much they don't win that battle, they do learn how to engage in that kind of experience. You don't promise any outcomes. That's kind of really important, and it would be foolish to imagine but encouraging young people to kind of work collectively in this way is going to necessarily achieve anything. And I think in this sense, I'd like to use that as a kind of, if you think this works, as a kind of segue, because I don't really believe that much of the research I've done makes much of a difference, or is indeed terribly successful. And this goes back to Nancy's point about policy and the effect of qualitative research and kind of people's sense of what matters. In England, there's this phrase that was very popular under the last Labour government about evidence-based policy making. And the argument is that research is a kind of rational process. and that all that's holding back social change is the lack of kind of evidence and understanding. And that's clearly absolutely not true, because policy is only really used as a way of kind of promoting solutions that will suit the people who are in power, and the reverse almost happens, that you actually get kind of policy-based evidence making, that what's required are forms of story and narrative and understanding that kind of suits the kind of solution that's being proposed. I think what research does at its best, without being ridiculously cynical, is it creates constituencies of interest. So you might not succeed in persuading people in power to put all their money into working with young people or taking their voices terribly seriously, all the rest of it. But what research does do, is it creates a language and a way of kind of organizing and a way of kind of collecting around a set of understandings which you can help theorize and frame and put into some kind of shape and narrative. And that can be terribly kind of powerful. So another kind of example I want to tell you about is work that I did. This might sound, this isn't about young people, where I worked with an English national project called Creative Partnerships, which is all about getting artists to work with teachers and provide a range of creative projects for kids. And this was an enormous kind of centrally government funded project. I think they spent up to about £200 million on it over about 12 years or something. Now, the project was very varied in its outcomes, and kind of, or the initiative was very kind of varied in its outcomes, and it had a diverse range of effects. But what we did, working with the research and evaluation team, was to commission a lot of research, to create lots of literature reviews, because I think it's really what research can contribute are histories and ways of thinking about bodies of knowledge and kind of ideas that actually have a tradition. Because one of the kind of failures in a lot of kind of activist kind of research is to imagine that your problem is a completely new framing of the problem, where often it's a kind of restatement of a problem, and knowing about its history is a kind of extremely important. And we also, what the research also did was collect together kind of constituencies of different interests. So a lot of artists, a lot of teachers, a lot of different kinds of practitioners who are broadly creative people, parents, some school governors, and particularly some kind of head teachers or principals, as you call them in the US. What the research did was create validate the kind of activity, which is kind of a really important function of research, that besides the kind of theoretical framing, you give it some kind of authority and kind of weight, which can't be underestimated. And it allowed people to kind of organize and come together and see value in what they were doing. And that's kind of, it seems to me, the best you might hope for in realistic terms, rather than imagining you're going to get to kind of people with real money and really in power who are going to kind of flick a switch and change things. So it seems to me you constantly need to be strategic in this kind of research, and often that's at odds with some of the kind of will to truth that underpins some of the kind of language and values of kind of academic research, because it's not just a question of imagining you can do a disinterested inquiry into a problem. It's a way of framing a problem to give as large a constituency as possible of the different actors involved in that problem some sense of kind of purchase on the problem and some way of kind of feeling that what they do is kind of meaningful. I don't know if I explained that in enough specificity, so please ask if you want more details.
Well, I think that we'll go through in a little bit more detail about another project in a minute, but I just want to come back to that theory question, because that's actually emerged in a question on Etherpad as well, is kind of what's the importance of theory. And what I hear you saying, Julian, is that actually, to an extent, what we as academics can bring to this discussion with young people, with learning organizations and practitioners of various kinds, is kind of giving them a comparative and a theorized sense of what they're doing, so that they then can understand their own practice better, perhaps, or perhaps they're very reflective already about their practice, but they haven't got the capacity, usually time capacity, to kind of read it and engage with academic theory, and, as you say, kind of put what they are doing on a day-to-day basis within a broader spectrum of understanding. So the question is both what theory and what academic theory contributes to the projects that we work with, but also whether you feel in your own work, and Nancy, I'm going to open this to you as well, whether you feel like you have had the space to or have been able to make a kind of contribution to academic theorizing as well, in addition to the more policy or practitioner-facing work.
Well, the question is, what does a contribution to academic theory mean in that sense? It might be the sort of phrase, I mean, on one level, it's a question of whether you publish in academic peer-reviewed journals and get cited. I mean, on another, it's about whether you can find a way of kind of explaining and kind of framing a particular kind of problematic or a particular kind of practice that genuinely kind of takes the argument forward. Sometimes theorizing something is of greater interest to my peers, so fellow academics or scholars or researchers or practitioners, than it perhaps is to the people whose I purport to represent. And sometimes theory is a way of kind of explaining things to people on the ground in that way. So I think it's you have to be kind of, I mean, this comes down to how lucidly, no, not how lucidly, how clearly you can write. I mean, most research, most academic work is written to exclude, right? Most of the kind of ways of writing, the kinds of language we use, the kind of journals we write for, I mean, who reads them? It's difficult enough to get undergraduates to kind of read stuff written for by academics to be an academic, let alone other kind of constituencies. I mean, you know, one of the kind of classic things that always drives me mad is that I have to, whenever I do research for policy audiences, I have to reduce it to an executive summary, which has to really be 1 page. Because if I write anything that's longer than 1 page, nobody will read it. Okay, and I'm probably completely inarticulate and really kind of messy and hopelessly inclined to want to qualify everything I say. But unless you know, a lot of this comes down to how capable you are in terms of expressing yourself in simple, easy to understand, everyday language, and that's not the same thing. You know, whereas the kind of premium on being an academic is the reverse, and this can create professional difficulties, I dare say.
I can imagine that's true, and that actually touches on the questions that a lot of people had, which is, you know, balancing your own time, your own kind of professional work-life balance, everything that you're doing. You know, is this kind of work just considered, you know, the kind of, you know, little bit of research that you do when you're on your way to your kind of big academic journal articles, or is there a way to create actual, to get your colleagues to acknowledge it, to get tenure committees to acknowledge it, to work it into hiring processes, etc.? Nancy, I wonder if you could comment on that a little.
Sure. Well, one thing I'll say is I have very little work-life balance. So let's just put that right out on the table. I work a lot. And part of the, I mean, a lot of people work a lot in academia, so that's nothing new, and a lot of people work a lot in the kinds of youth-serving organizations that I work with. But certainly meeting the demands of academia and the demands of sort of being a respectful, useful partner to my community collaborators are considerable, and I've actually made some quite, explicit decisions, as I imagine Julian might have as well, to not be in a mainstream, what we call Senate faculty position in the United States, because my sense was that at the institution I'm at and where I'm located, really all of the work that it takes to pursue rigorous, mutually respectful, effective, participatory, collaborative, equity-focused research is pretty much considered service here. And so pretty much, 95% of what I spend my time doing is not the focus of my position description, which is assessed entirely on peer-reviewed academic journal articles. And so I'm in a non-tenured faculty position, which gives me a fair bit more flexibility, and I don't carry a regular teaching load. I can teach when I want to. I do work with students a lot, actually, through my projects and on committees. I will say that we've had a little internal family experiment going on in my family. I've chosen to pursue this type of position, and my partner is in a now tenured faculty appointment. So he does quite similar work. He's done that through a tenure track position. It's been extremely challenging, but he has been successful in getting tenure. So I think this kind of work can be pursued in multiple ways in an academic context, but it's certainly not an easy fit, particularly if you want to be in an academic appointment that carries what we call PI, or principal investigator status.
Okay, so I mean, it's a realistic, I think, assessment of how, if you are interested in doing this kind of work, you're going to have to work hard to create other kinds of value within your job trajectory if you are on a tenure track, or if you are applying to get onto the tenure track, in terms of how to express this work. But one thing that we might say is that one of the rationales for doing participatory research, in addition to it being, perhaps a socially good thing to do, is that it allows for a unique contribution to academic knowledge as well. So in addition to it, being motivated by these social questions which we are trying to address, or desire to make young people's lives better, or desire to address problems, it also, in theory, is good for academic research. So I wondered if you guys could say a little bit more, and I know Julian's perhaps a bit more familiar with the DML community than you may be, Nancy, but I know you will have worked a lot with learning. What is is there a unique contribution that participatory research can make to our knowledge and understanding of what young people's learning trajectories are, and perhaps particularly in relationship to digital media and to technology? Is there a way that participatory or community-based research offers something new in terms of the kind of intellectual contribution?
My instinct as a first answer to that is no. I think it would be arrogant and misplaced to imagine that any one particular method or kind of approach, in a sense, offered a privileged kind of way to answer that kind of challenge. And I was thinking, when you were talking about, you were outlining the sort of virtues of what participatory research might contribute to intellectual understanding. I was thinking the same language could be used by a kind of medical researcher in terms of, improving the quality of life. The same outcomes are kind of there in that kind of way. So it's probably just a bit arrogant to imagine that participatory research offers a particular kind of privileged route to a certain kind of understanding. This isn't to say that it has no value at all, and that the kind of collaborative and political work that I think we've been talking about clearly has a particular way of kind of engaging participants in ways that other kinds of research doesn't. So that I think the kind of impact the direct and immediate impact you have as a consequence of the research is kind of there and kind of part of your life, as opposed to simply a sort of indirect effect of publication from that point of view. And clearly there are ways in which forms of direct, collaborative, community-based research are actually just better than, for example, tedious psychology-based forms of questionnaire, for example, and think, I mean, so that a lot of what passes as academic research isn't terribly insightful or terribly useful. So it's just a question of being a little bit more honest and kind of onto the point about what is going to get you the best kind of knowledge, as well as thinking about its direct and indirect kind of political effects.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, just to reiterate, was, what is the potential contribution? And I take Julian's point that there's contributions that many different kinds of methodologies can have. But as we're talking about this one, this series of methodologies, which are actually much more complex than we've had a chance to delve into here, although we will talk about a bit more in the following webinar next week. What's the contribution that this can make to our knowledge of particularly digital media and learning, where you might talk about learning more specifically?
Am I supposed to answer that?
Oh, sorry. It was actually for Nancy. Nancy, do you have some final thoughts on that question?
Sorry. I very much agree with Julian that that it doesn't make sense to privilege one particular method over others. I think multiple methods are important, and mixed methods are important for that matter as well, and that's really a direction that I've gone in my work. And just to be very clear, some of my work is participatory action research, some of it is not. And what I've found particularly powerful is bringing together multiple methods. So, for example, I've been engaged in a study looking at the relationship between regional well-being and youth vitality and sustainability, or regional well-being and sustainability and youth well-being. And that's drawn upon qualitative analyses, quantitative analyses, and youth participatory action research. So really integrating the three, which has resulted in some really interesting kinds of transdisciplinary thinking. I think what participatory action research has to offer to the sort of knowledge generation project is, on the one hand, the potential generation of new kinds of questions that those of us sitting in our offices at universities may not even think about, and so I think that's a potentially powerful contribution. And then when you're looking at some of the kinds of really complex challenges that folks are looking to really define and solve, we really require multiple ways of knowing to tackle those challenges. And so participatory action research offers the opportunity to create these kinds of trans-epistemic communities to work on some of these issues. And so I think that that there's a real potential in that from the knowledge generation vantage point.
Excellent, thank you. Julian, you had another thought you wanted to add to that?
Just to kind of chip in, I think one of the large political questions around the whole DML initiative and their whole attempt to kind of help reframe what might be going on with young people and learning in the current era is that orthodox research clearly has a way of framing the value and meaning of education in a particular kind of way. And one of the difficulties that a lot of us in the DML community consistently struggle with, and not just in the DML community obviously, is a way of kind of framing values, a value and meaning to understanding other kinds of learning than the ways that outcomes are currently defined through conservative research, in which the academy is consistently complicit. So part of the value of alternative and different kinds of methodologies and methods are that they do obviously help us open up other kinds of questions to which there may be other kinds of answers. And that, it seems to me, is the kind of main merit of this. Although by the same token, you don't want to become just a sort of conservative radical, so that you end up asking questions that don't kind of engage with an audience at all. If I've expressed myself clearly enough, that we have to find different kinds of methods can help us ask different kinds of questions than what is usually asked about what we're talking about when it comes to kids and the schools and education and learning in general. But we have to keep on the edge of the curve. Otherwise, we're simply going to become another kind of orthodoxy, and that can happen with radical, and has happened classically with more radical methods over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm aware that we still have quite a lot of questions unanswered, and perhaps we can carry this conversation on Twitter, and we'll get some more opportunity to discuss this during the webinar next week. But I just wanted to quickly underline that last point. I think you both made it an excellent point, and in slightly two different ways, but that one of the ways that participatory research kind of contributes to our body of research knowledge is by stretching our research questions themselves and kind of teaching us to look for more unanticipated outcomes as well. And one of the reasons for that, and I am in agreement with Julian in saying that the ways in which learning is quantified and defined is often very narrow. So perhaps this kind of research allows for a wider body of what is considered learning at all, but that, again, we need to kind of keep an eye on who this research is for and not make such outlandish claims that we can't then continue to kind of speak to policymakers and practitioner audiences that it can make sense of and perhaps action some of the insights that we're producing. So with that, we're going to finish this very rich seminar here. Sorry, Nancy, did you want to say one more thing? No, just okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So I think we're going to have to finish there. Anna's going to give us a little bit of information about the webinar next week, and thank you to everyone for participating on Twitter and on the Etherpad. I shall now get a chance to read more about all of your comments, and thanks to everyone.
Really great. So now that we're at the end of our hour, we wanted to take this last minute to thank Julian and Nancy for their contribution, but also thank all of those watching and participating on the Etherpad on Twitter, and thanks to Jameson for all of his help with the technical setup of the Hangout. So next week our unit continues, and we will be joined by Sasha Constanza Chalk and Joanna Zaat-Salonen, as well as Melissa Butcher, highlighting the practical issues related to setting up a participatory inquiry process. However, in the meantime, we'd like to remind you of our activity. If you could please share and add to the pool of resources and project, and really add to the Twitter conversation, perhaps taking some of the questions that weren't answered today over to Twitter and continuing this rich conversation around participatory and community-based research. If you'd like to keep updated about future DML Commons salons and other events, sign up for the newsletter at dmlcommons.net, and you can also follow the conversation through Twitter at DML Commons. Thanks so much.
Thank you.